Welcome, my friends. I'm back with another video. I'm going to do a few, I think, in a row um, that have to do with my creative pursuits over the years and trying to boil them down to a digestible portion. Um, this is all kind of anticipation of doing the actual relaunch of my website. I did the um, cold launch of my website in 2015. No, I'm sorry, 2019. I even had like a virtual event online. A few people attended. I didn't have much on the website, and I had some things on related groups that were discussing the website and what it was going to be. So now it hasn't become much of that over the last few years. The groups have continued to grow, though. In the last year, they've kind of stalled out as far as what I've been contributing. Well, just in the last year because of my hand issues, and the interest among members haven't been very high. Um, but I have a few fans, and I've managed to find a few more here and there. So hopefully, that will continue to grow. But I want the website to be to where you can just go to the website and get the work and see the work and understand what it is. So um, I created about a dozen videos on here, starting with my very first one a year and a half ago called "What the Hell is Flicker Street?" And I attempted to answer that in those videos, and then I did some Flicker Street supplementary videos, such as a shift in human consciousness, and um, the death of Zap Valley. Um, and initially they received a bit of attention, and I think people got lost in my kind of rambling, but I'm not sure which is more convoluted, the story behind Flicker Street or the story of Flicker Street, the story that is probably the latter. But the former, yeah, I've boiled it down to periods in my life and how this story developed. So I'm going to try to put it into one or two videos concisely instead of spread out with all these other anecdotes and things. And then we're going to get into a video that I will use as the introduction to the main piece on the website. And I'll eventually upload, I will link all the Flicker Street videos at some point or another onto the website, just for completism's sake, in case anyone wants to go back and see all that, and find out all the details and trivia, etc. So, I wear my special hat today, so you can tell I'm serious about this. So I broke this down into like 5 periods, I think, in my life, in which Flicker Street was a work, that I was working on, a work in progress, or the kind of proto story that evolved into Flicker Street. So the first one is the late 70s to about 1981. I was a very young child. I had a slightly older friend named Thomas Davis. And basically, Thomas had created a group of superheroes called the Sensational Seven. I'm fixing my lighting. And, they were pretty cool. I mean, for his age, our ages, yeah, wild. They were very heavily influenced by Jack Kirby. And all the Marvel comics that were present at that time. We were kind of Marvel zombies, what was later known as Marvel zombies. We rarely ventured into DC territory, though we both did from time to time, and me actually a little bit more than him. When I had my fill of things to read, I might see a DC book that caught my attention and ask my mother to buy it for me. Oddly, maybe coincidentally, maybe not, the stories that I often picked up that DC did were either by or inspired by the works of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. So, who I knew by name, by the time I was in elementary school, I had not yet read all of the original run of Ditko's Spider-Mans or the early Hulks, Avengers. I had just read reprints here and there. I bought a few reprints, or my mom bought them when they came out. And then there were some pocketbooks towards 1980 and 79, 80 that kind of filled in a lot of gaps for me. But that's slightly after where I'm at now. Where I'm at now is basically the Pleistocene era of Flicker Street in a way. And basically, it was Thomas just calling me and thinking of ideas, and he'd just say, "What about this?" Or he would just kind of act like it already existed. That was kind of the conceit of what we did, which he called Dynamite Comics back then. And I later dispensed with that in the 1980s, thinking this will never sound cool or interesting. And now there's a Dynamite Entertainment that's fairly successful, so you just never know. But um, I was excited by these things. I mean, he would relay them to me as though there had been a whole run of issues all these years detailing these characters, from the 40s onward, kind of parallel to Marvel and DC superheroes. So he had kind of created Golden Age and Silver Age eras within his vision of Dynamite Comics. Of course, we could never go back and write and draw and publish all those fake comic books, but it was interesting. It was a meta level of things to which we had no clue of at the time. But it was a way. Thomas was inspired heavily by Stan Lee, and that he was into selling the ideas just as much as he was by Jack Kirby into conceiving the ideas. He was kind of like the two combined, but very young, very precocious, very derivative of not only their works and some DC works, but also of movies he would watch and TV episodes he would watch. In this sense, he was much more creative than me. I had not yet translated all of these things into, channeling them into something that came forth from me. So I asked Thomas. I mean, I had a couple of superheroes I'd made up when I was very young, and some of them I've forgotten. One of them I eventually remembered, and I did work into the Flicker Street universe recently, though updated and altered. But I just had to include him. And Thomas said, "I'll make you up a team too," and I think he called it the Super Six or the Liberty League. Went through a few names and could never really come up with anything that was really distinctive for Marvel and DC. Sensational Seven stood out, but it hasn't really stood the test of time for me. I'll probably work the phrase in somewhere in something with Flicker Street, just almost as an homage, but it's not going to be an official name of any group of heroes or whatever. In Thomas's world of Dynamite Comics, basically there was the Sensational Seven, and they were superheroes that were like the Avengers, and they argued amongst themselves. They received calls for urgency and world-shaking matters, which they answered. And then their sister team that he put into my hands, not very capable hands, would do kind of the same thing. They each were led by kind of a mysterious or magical kind of figure. They each had a kind of a cynical, I guess now I see them as conservative, kind of a tough guy of that era, kind of an aging tough guy, kind of a Clint Eastwood-ish in the 70s kind of personage. Charles Bronson, maybe. And that was what was influencing us and our fathers, and mothers. And of course, there were wisecracking heroes all through Marvel and DC, especially Marvel, The Thing and Hawkeye and, even Nick Fury. A lot of them had the broken speech patterns and came up with these insults for other characters and demeaning names for them. And, they just had this kind of world weary, get on with it attitude. And they were kind of tough and, So, other than those kind of factors, they weren't really very distinguished. And, the characters, especially in the team he gave me, were almost completely forgettable, really. I've mostly forgotten them. Though I have incorporated like a few little seeds here and there. And that's kind of what Dynamite Comics was then. It was like seeds for something I would do later in life. Um, so the next day, well, I want to say this. So Thomas moved away in 1978. I was very young and it traumatized me. He was my best friend. He was my only friend. And he continued to do his Dynamite Comics. But now he shifted to what he called the Freedom Squad, which is a concept he eventually turned over to me. And I've incorporated that phrase, that term, that name into my stories with a different kind of twist because he kind of defined the Freedom Squad loosely as answering to or affiliated with a shield like organization. Um, I've retained that. The Freedom Squad, Freedom Squad, quote unquote, basically works for Freedom Central as their head, it's a government clandestine organization that this organization called React is in charge of. React is basically, yes, the equivalent of Shield, or in real life, really, as time goes on, it's become more and more like real life, like the CIA, FBI, and these kind of cesspools of corruption and uh, shaping world events. And of course, within this kind of story, what I arrived at is that React was formed around 1939. And a lot of it was to explore the slow rise of supernatural and paranormal and superhuman occurrences and deal with them. And of course, that theme's been used in various other books, TV shows, movies, comics. Nothing new, but I had to codify React. That's all Flicker Street canon. But this was just the basic idea. Um, and he had some other solo characters. Well, I decided to make a solo character or two. At one point, I did a comic called. Now, when I say I did a comic, I would just draw the ideas and then just kind of act out my mind, or even out loud, or even sometimes out in the woods behind my house. My neighbors were, convinced I was certified, certifiable, and I probably was. Um, I would take sticks for swords and guns, etc. So this was kind of my world. I have friends who are on the spectrum, so to speak, and they seem to find it hard to believe that I was once, almost like that myself. But I was, and so I understand more of it than sometimes neurodivergent people give me credit for. And I also believe that there are ways to overcome some of those things. Not all of them are possible given the wiring of the brain. Just like I can't completely eliminate depression from my mind. I wish I could, but I can certainly treat it and cope with its effects, etc., and modify my behavior accordingly in order to treat it myself and to seek help as well. And I have some friends who really I think should be doing all that, and they're really not, and it's unfortunate. It's sad, heartbreaking. So back to the swinging 70s. So I created this character maybe around 79 called Nemesis. And, I didn't see any characters in comics named Nemesis yet at that time. He was kind of like my answer to the Hulk, but he was a little more supernatural. I developed him fairly quickly and then just kind of put him aside. But he was kind of like my pet thing. And that was something that I was really proud of. And then I took um, a couple of one or two of the characters out of the team Thomas had made up for me and given them a couple of some personal lives and background stories, and a lot of it was very derivative of the Marvel comics I was reading at the time. um, I was really into at that time, as the 70s closed, I guess the writers I was following most at Marvel were Kirby, who was leaving again, Jim Shooter before he became an editor and an asshole, David Kraft, the late Dave Kraft, a great guy that I knew, um, Steve Englehart, and of course Steve Gerber, the great Steve Gerber. So I'm probably forget those, and Roy Thomas. Those were the main ones. Um, but I was a Marvel nut. One story I came up with, or comic I came up with, is called The Face of Death, and it was basically just about death. and I didn't have the ability to write any kind of anthology stories, built around it, but that was the concept. And it was never realized. Marvel had a close concept called War is Hell. A character, John Kowalski, died, and I think it's World War II, and he became melded with death itself. And later, Chris Claremont, pardon the pun, resurrected that character in his run on Man Thing, which, except for that issue that focuses on John Kowalski and also features Dakeem the Enchanter and some other old characters, most of that series is just about unreadable. I mean, for what it is, it's mediocre. But then when you put it in the context of Man Thing, and especially Gerber, it's pretty dreadful stuff. And then really issue number 11, the last issue, was a direct copy of issue 22, 1122, of the original series by Gerber, which that was the last issue. And in both of them, the writer appears. And Gerber is spoken to by Dakeem, and it turns out Dakeem is recounting these adventures to Steve, and that's how he knows all about this. So, they claim in issue 11 of the second series that Dakeem has passed the torch to Chris Claremont, and now it's going to end as well. In my head canon, he never passed it to anybody else. I mean, but anyway, my point is there was a John Kowalski, like a Death Itself character. This is years before all the other Death Itself characters, and years before, of course, Neil Gaiman's death, which kind of became the most emblematic, most well-known in popular culture from comics character that is Death. So my Death never really got anywhere. I mean, I even tried to cross him, whatever, over with a couple of the other characters. They were just silly little stories, but I had notes and I had drawings, and Thomas was always coming up with something crazy. We would talk long distance once a week or once every 2 weeks, and back then long distance was very expensive. So that era kind of ended with, a few characters. I created a couple of new characters that I was going to slot in with that team, and I was going to refurbish that team completely. I was going to call it Liberty League for a while, and did, I guess. But I wanted to create new blood in it, and I created a character named Stephen Bartholomew, and I created his best friend named David, and at the time I didn't have a last name for him. But I did have like a superhero pseudonym for him, which now it would be incredibly, I guess, awkward to use, but he was named Corona. And it was after, Corona, like a field of energy around you, like the sun. And I thought that was great. It was the first name I made up that I really felt was cool and original, but, now I'll never use. I mean, I had not really intended to use it in the modern day for sure, but I kind of had it there on the back burner still. But then this coronavirus killed all that. Damn it. But yeah, Corona and Stephen Bartholomew. I think I called him like Swashbuckler and Myrmidon and different names. But Bartholomew is probably the longest running character that I've been developing ever since that time. He's a major character now in my story, and he's kind of grown along with me, but I mean, the character's about 10 years older than me, but we've developed together. And so the summer before high school, I had hooked up this younger kid named JJ, and I had a couple other friends that I would talk to back and forth that did art. And then by chance, I met this really strange kind of vagabond like kid named Christopher Pack. I met him at a comic book store, and we just started talking, and I got kind of obsessed with him. Like, I didn't have many friends, and I looked him up in the phone book, and I called him, and next week he came to my house. We listened to the Beatles album Hey Jude together, and he told me about some comics he was making, which were hard for me to comprehend. I mean, they were very dark compared to anything that I'd ever done or been involved with. Not that I'd been involved with much at that age, but it resonated ultimately with me. I wanted to incorporate them into what JJ and I were going to do with Thomas's concepts and my concepts from that embryonic stage. We're going to retain some, jettison some, and Thomas was involved with all this. We would talk, and he would be like, "You guys just make up whatever you want," and we'll just also say it takes place in this universe, and it'll be all good. We didn't say all good back then, though. But Christopher was heavily influenced by Jim Starlin, which I had not read a lot of Jim Starlin's work up to that time. I'd enjoyed his art in Captain Marvel, and I guess he was writing it when I looked at it. And I was reading it, but I didn't follow it. I didn't follow the Warlock series. I knew who Warlock was, but I didn't have any of those issues. And to be honest, they seemed a little bit bizarre even to me. Like there were a few comics that I thought were cool, but were a little bit out of my comfort zone, like Howard the Duck and Kill Raven, Conan in a way. There's probably 5 or 6 other ones. But eventually all of them, I sought them out in the 80s and was like, damn, I was missing out as a kid. But that's okay. I can't get Master of Kung Fu was one. I can't get my mom to buy me everything. We didn't have a lot of money. So in 1982, we went into high school, and I with Thomas Long Distance and JJ and Christopher Pack and a couple of other friends. We went ahead and did Dynamite Comics, and I was like, we're going to publish this, and we're going to incorporate and be a company, and the company will own everything like Marvel. So if I die, all these characters are owned by the company. If any of us dies, we're all replaceable. Man, I'm like, I'm so far different from that mindset now. It is frightening, and it's good. I guess I was a company man, as John Byrne called himself proudly, like a fucking moron when he was at Marvel. And yeah, I was a company man, but it was my company. I mean, really, I was using Thomas's permission, but I was running it down here. It's like the Charlotte chapter of Dynamite Comics, and Thomas was in Missouri. But I think Thomas liked the fact other people enjoyed his characters. He liked the idea of a comics company. And he was still spitting out concepts, and he was mostly writing the Freedom Squad and their long winding adventures. He had a couple of other weird comics that just never took, like Puppet People, which of course, was not an original name or phrase, so it ended up being jettisoned. But in any case, within a couple of years, we had created a lot of material, and I'm not being megalomaniacal. I created the vast majority of the material and the vast majority of the character designs and names. And sometimes someone would create an idea for a character, but wouldn't have a name for them or a real name for them or even really much of anything about them. And I would just make all that stuff up. So, over time, the idea of the company owning everything, that seemed cool for back then with that process. But after a while, it's like, I don't know, it didn't seem ultimately like fair, because I had already started reading about, people stealing Jack Kirby's artwork and Neil Adams suing for getting the lawsuit going for Siegel and Schuster. So I was becoming aware, and of course Steve Gerber, my hero, and all the stuff with Howard the Duck. So I was becoming aware of creators' rights more and more. So that was evolving even as this was going on, the philosophy behind it. So I kind of dropped the financial angle. We had been saving money to try to publish something, and there was a lot of infighting, and there was a lot of people who came in and out, like artists, and they didn't contribute anything creatively. They would just draw the characters that we already had, and we would try to get them to do stuff for us, but we couldn't pay them or anything. If anything, they were helping us by occasionally chipping in to publish the comic. But some of them were friends, some of them weren't friends. But it was all, the idea became too much to where it meant too much to me, I think, and it meant too much to JJ and to another member in particular who I really don't want to name because there's a lot of bad blood there, or was. And that all fell apart. So by the time my second year of high school was ending, me and Christopher kind of regrouped with a good friend of ours, Doug Williams, who I still know, a really great artist. I don't think he draws much anymore. He's also a musician and a comedian, among other many things. His band, Willie Douglas Band, is doing pretty well around here. The three of us regrouped with a couple of younger friends. A grade or two behind us, this kid named Jack, and this kid named who was the last couple of guys? Jack. For a little while, we had a kid named Ben Lee, who was a Vietnamese kid, great artist. But eventually he got bored with what we were doing too and wanted to do his own thing. So in his stead, we got a friend named Jeff Currents that Chris knew, and Chris knew him. And so we were kind of like the lone five, the last five. And I spent the summer between 11th and 12th grade very depressed about the situation. And finally, I decided to end it. It wasn't the same without JJ, and Thomas was, I think, losing interest in a way. He wasn't as interested. He had no interest in all the internal struggles between us here in Charlotte. And I don't blame him. I mean, he didn't know any of these people. I think he knew one of them briefly. I mean, but I was really his only tether to Charlotte. I was involved with this, so he had no real stakes in this as a friend or a collaborator. And I think by then he had kind of given up on the idea of ever doing anything with this other than just a fun creative outlet for himself. So with all that going against us, I ended this project, and that was it. So Dynamite Comics ended mid-1984, the end of an era. So let's get into the third phase of this story. So in 1985, me and Jeff Currents and Christopher Pack were still collaborating creatively. And they introduced me to a good friend, a guy who became a good friend, Vincent Black. And I also had a friend named Derek Townsend that I met who was doing his own comics and characters. And I liked his characters and I wanted to cross over his characters, but I didn't really have any characters to cross over with. I was like, I'm not going to use any Dynamite Comics characters. Even though I was still doing illustrations of some of them. I did a really nice illustration, all with brush, of Nemesis. Unfortunately, it's gone with one of my huge illustration books. I lost all my art, all my original big-sized art, except one piece in my move in 2015, which is still pretty soul-destroying. So yeah, I didn't want to use any of those characters. I wanted to start new. I made up a group that was called the Anarchists, and the Anarchists they were all analogs to the Defenders, which was my favorite comic book. Which ended to me unceremoniously and showed kind of the victory of Marvel and Jim Shooter and corporate America over idiosyncratic creators. It meant a lot to me. I wrote a long letter to Marvel. Of course, I never sent it. It probably would have not have been that good, but it was from the heart. I tried to do a Defenders history and submit it to the Amazing Heroes magazine and never finished it. I've always been bad about finishing big projects that I set out for myself, I admit. So the five of us were doing all kinds of projects. Vincent had one called The Four Aces, and Derek had his thing, and we would and then Christopher still wanted to do this kind of dark, operatic kind of stuff. And, time went by, and, nothing really came of it. And when high school was over and I got my first job, it was full time, and I really didn't have any energy to draw, and I barely drew for like a year or two. And didn't create any new characters. Well, I had some ideas, but I didn't really create any new characters because I was afraid to create. I did create one book called Vigilus that I wanted to do, which was Vigilus was like a religious-based superhero, but not preachy. Pardon the pun. I didn't want it to be, but I mean the main character, his name was like Kendall Parrish, which I've always liked, but I don't use because I've broken it into other names of characters. And I don't use Vigilus eventually morphed into this character Vigil that I do have. But Vigilus, it was like a soap opera revolving around a church, and basically the church was corrupt, and Vigilus had acquired these powers. Kendall Parrish had acquired these powers, and he was going, people thought he got them from God, and there was kind of an ambiguity whether he did. And he would battle these people, and finally the corrupt people, because this was the televangelist era, and I was moving away from Christianity, and I really hated the televangelists and the Christian right and Republicans by 1985 and 1986. And so, yeah, they made their own kind of superpowered guy to square off against him. I don't remember his name. I kind of combined those two into Vigil. Vigil's my statement on that. He's not a frontline character, but he's always been a sideline villain with a real interesting backstory and concept. But that's in Flicker Street day. So other than that, it kind of petered out. And finally, JJ and I started talking again and hanging out a lot. And, Christopher went away to the military. A couple other guys that we had worked with briefly in high school on this went away to the military. It was a weird time. Vincent and Jeff Currents were still doing their own thing. Derek was doing his own thing, but we were all kind of fragmenting. A lot of like Derek was getting way into girls and drugs, and Vincent was also getting into music, and I don't know, it kind of, the five of us never really cohered the way Dynamite Comics did, but it was cool. It was nice. I wanted something free and open, and I could breathe in, and so I started community college, and I had a bunch of ideas, and I had a bunch of ideas from my first job. I mean, I would like base little characters on people I knew, and in my head, they all started to seem to fit where I was going story wise, not the other people. A little bit JJ, and definitely Christopher Pack with his dark operatic stuff, but basically where me and sort of those two guys were definitely going. It was far away from where we were with Thomas and the childhood stuff. We were making up new characters and adapting existing characters in much more experimental and darker ways, heavily influenced by soap opera writing. I was a big fan of Douglas Marland, who had done General Hospital. I mean, he wrote the classic Luke Spencer stuff. He created a great character called Quentin McCord, a tormented archaeologist for A Guiding Light. I loved his work. And at that time, he had just taken over As the World Turns, so I had more ideas. So some of the stuff was quite derivative at the time of scenes and plots from other media. Basically me and JJ would just hash it out. And, everyone else kind of felt, there was really no one else. In other words, Christopher wasn't interested in rebuilding Dynamite Comics with us. And, he always said, yeah, I'll be around. He had a real funny way of talking. Hey. Like Yogi Bear meets, Art Carney as Norton. And what a trip. He passed away in the 2010s. R.I.P. Chris. And but we were great friends back then. But he was always like, I'll be around if you need me, man. But he didn't really create much other than his basic set of characters and kind of this doomy thing. And he'd write these doomy epic poems and then song lyrics, and he was a trip. And but eventually he drifted into crime, and creativity kind of took the back seat to crime. It's unfortunate. But so it's just me and JJ, and we were like, we started world building. And again, I did the vast majority of things, but he came up with a lot of stuff. And in the long run, some of it's been usable and some of it hasn't. It definitely has been inspirational. And I've been able to retain some elements and alter them enough to where I feel like I'm not ripping him off, because, what happened with that situation was 1987 was like the peak of that period of my creativity. I was kind of declining as an artist as far as finishing really nice, complete pieces of art. But as far as like ideas and designs and just my whole thing, creating characters, plots, and integrating world building, 1987 was just this amazing time for me. I was taking art classes in college, and I would, after class or between classes, I would sit upstairs. And this is back when you could sit upstairs at a college in the mid-afternoon on a Friday. Everybody would be gone. They'd be gone to their, night jobs. Nowadays, Charlotte is so packed with people, you would never have that kind of quiet. But yeah, and I would write in my notebooks, and I would see people I knew and people that caught my attention. I'd sketch them. I'd make them into characters. If I knew them pretty well, I'd have some of their characteristics. My stories got more about people and their problems, their especially romances and their dark sides. They were tormented, angst-ridden, and there was corruption, there was redemption. So these are some key elements, and redemption and romance became my top two. for a while, and my good friend Bill White once said, "Hey, those are the only two that matter, man." Um, so yeah, I mean, it began to take shape as something of its own that came out of me. I mean, there were other elements feeding into it. There were people who had helped me get to this place, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Um, but it was mine. I realized that this is mine. This is what I'm doing, and I'm going to keep doing it as a permanent creative outlet. I'm not going to expect to be able to publish it. But I decided it was kind of like my therapy, and I was never going to stop. And I couldn't because it was in my head. The stories began revealing themselves to me, like received wisdom. And that was the beginning of channeling, and I didn't realize it at the time. Um, I mean, I knew about those ideas that an epiphany will come to you and all this stuff. I even later had a band called Epiphany, but um, I didn't realize the extent of what was happening. And when JJ went away to the army, that was like the final blow because at that time he was my best friend, you know. And but I didn't know about class consciousness then. I was ignorant of that, and he and his family and friends they always looked down on me for being poor and weird. Um, and he visited briefly, like a year and a half later, and well, he visited a year later, and a couple of friends of mine went to see him, and his little brother had us sit in the foyer, and he never came back. He avoided coming back to see me because when he first got into the army, he'd sent me a couple of letters with new ideas uh, for for our dynamite. I mean, we still kind of we just called it dynamite then. Dynamite was basically just the work he and I were kind of doing together. Um, and I was also going in a different direction, just trying new stuff, all the time. And I liked a lot of his ideas, but something happened. He quit returning my calls. He quit, returning my letters, and that was that. So I just assumed he wasn't interested. So another year passed by, and he came to town, and I was like, I wanted to reunite with him as a friend. I didn't care about the creative stuff. I knew obviously he was not into that anymore. He looked down upon that as a part of his culture now, and that was quite a lesson to learn. Quite a lesson to learn. And by that time, I was dressed kind of like this. I mean, I didn't have a long, long, long beard, a goatee, because they wouldn't let me at the grocery store I worked at. But I had longish hair, I had a mustache that curved down, and I wore the big hats and I wore long coats. I actually dressed much more flamboyantly than I do now. But I had started wearing all black and a lot of purple and a lot of jewelry. And JJ thought I was kind of a freak, and he didn't like the idea that I had a girlfriend, which again, at the time, I didn't understand that reaction, but later, through problems with another best friend, I kind of did. Just unhealthy male programming. Um, so that was that. Never seen him again, and that's when I really got down with it. For a short time, Christopher and another guy we knew in high school, they had both come back from the army, and again, they were kind of around kibitzing, and I would tell them these ideas, and sometimes they'd throw out a nugget here and there, but they weren't into the world. They weren't able to do the world building. They didn't have the attention span to do it. They were very helpful in a lot of ways, but they were more perfunctory ways, not like creative ways. And then by the end of '89, I guess going into '90, that was that. I mean, I still was friends with Christopher, but we really didn't talk about that stuff anymore. And I didn't talk to anyone else about it anymore. I mean, occasionally someone like Vincent or Doug that I still knew would like bring stuff up, like, are you still drawing those characters? You remember what you did in high school and junior high? Well, high school. And I'd be like, yeah. So that was kind of the turning point, really. So I guess what happened the next phase. So how many phases have I gone through now? 70s, 80s, 82, 84, 85 to 89. So, well, the next phase, I didn't write down my notes, so I'm winging this one, but I lived it. The next phase really was, I would say, the next 10 years. I wrote on this a lot. I took a break for a short time in roughly 91, 92, though so still creating new characters. I had a really great girlfriend, and I created a character based on her. Um, and I was continuing the storylines that I had been tackling in 89 and 90. And in that period, I created new characters and really started shaking things up with a lot of different new ideas that I was really excited about. I was taking a lot of ideas like telepathy and things and really getting into hardcore science fiction ideas that I was excited by. And at that time, I was uh, inspired a lot by Grant Morrison. I was collecting his Animal Man and Doom Patrol. So I guess he inspired me the way Gerber had earlier, but I didn't want to copy him. Well, for a little while, I kind of did want to copy him. The closest I came is I went backwards in time and I created it because, Flicker Street, it wasn't called Flicker Street then. This now entity, which was Dynamite, before that was Dynamite Comics, now it's kind of nameless, but it was just me. This world was set in the present day in that world, adjacent to our world. But I made up a time frame. I made up some stories set in the 1970s, and I started grooving on that and getting into that period. And it was kind of going to be backstory for the current stories. And some of those characters made it through and are still valuable. I was able to construct some really nice family trees, linking people together. And one character that I think ultimately was kind of influenced by uh, Grant Morrison. And mind you, I was still friends with Christopher, and he was really into Grant Morrison too. He just wasn't creating anything of his own. But that whole milieu and that mindset led me to create this character called the Absurd Tentacle. And he just came to me, and I thought, man, most of the guys that we used to talk about these comics would like tell me that was a stupid name. What the fuck does that mean? That's not a superhero name. And you're right, and it's not a superhero name. The Absurd Tentacle's real name is Orphe Delander, or Orpheus Delander, and he's been a pivotal character all along since then. And by the present, the reason why he was not in the stories in the present day is he was believed destroyed. And I really played a long arc all through the 1990s, both my time and the time set in that world, building up all this behind the scenes stuff of his eventual return. It was very complex. I was filling notebook after notebook after notebook. In 1995, my back went out, and I was out of work for 3 months. And I did a lot of writing. I did a lot of reading. I did a lot of listening to jazz, and it was the next leap in consciousness. The channeling became more intense. I could tell you at any moment what all these characters were doing, and I was struggling to write it all down and keep track of it. And a lot of it I didn't write down, unfortunately. Some of it I remember, but a lot of it I've lost. But I did thankfully write down hundreds and hundreds of pages, which I still have in a box about 2 feet from me. And in 1995, I just came up with Flicker Street. It was kind of like my idea. I guess the term first hit me like in 1993. I would go on trips with my then girlfriend Anne. Sometimes my friend Jeremy Horn, who was also my roommate later, would go with us. We'd go to Atlanta, especially a lot, and sometimes we'd go to Chapel Hill, Winston-Salem. And I would see these kind of scenes that Charlotte was struggling to have, which were coherent scenes with, artists and hipsters that weren't just hipsters and they weren't just cliques. They were actually creating stuff. They were actually unconventional in their political views. They actually had great taste in music and film and things. So it was very different. And that whole idea, that schism between the authentic and the phony, that created the idea of Flicker Street. It was going to be like a locus point in my main city of Hallmark where this stuff happened. At the time, I patterned in my head after Little 5 Points in Atlanta. Now, I don't say it looks like that or anything, but it's just that basic idea of what Little 5 Points was in, say, 1993, 1994. For people in Charlotte, we went there and it was like, wow, this is the real stuff. We didn't have it that here. And so it went. And it kept on and kept on. And then I went through a long, bad period of depression, which lasted, almost 3 years. and I ran out of money. I couldn't find a roommate that lasted. I could not. I was terrified to talk to girls. I had totally gone backwards, even though I'd had a few girlfriends, and I was, yeah, I was a mess. But so my mind began creating more currents of this, like developing existing characters and their pain and tragedy. A lot of it I poured into this one character, Simon, in particular, who just couldn't seem to catch a break, man. I mean, it was misery, it was sadness. He was a dark loner, but he was trying to contribute. He was trying to be someone. And he became kind of a metaphor to me of what my life was like. I mean, he was one of my alters, so to speak. There's a number of characters I consider my alter egos that I closely feel, and act into. And some of them are now dead in the story, but some of them are still alive. Simon is about to die. Is done, it dies in my current thing I'm writing. That was a big decision to me to do that, but it really wasn't decided. It just happened. It had to be. Um, but anyway, that's where I was, and that kind of spilled over into the millennium. And I was still doing work on Simon, and I had a new character, Leo Rosegrave, who was fascinating to me, and some new ideas. But around 2001, they just kind of petered out. And then that was kind of the end. 2002 to 2005, I had another long depression and really hard mental illness issues. And I couldn't get over a breakup with a girl I'd been with named Morgan. And that by this time, though, I was getting treatment. So my life was built around my treatment. And I was still maintaining a full time job. Toward the end of that period, around 2005, I was feeling somewhat healthier. And that's where we go into the next phase. I think the fourth phase kind of ends around 2001. So I really think 2002 to around 2007, there was really no activity. There were 5 or 6 years, the longest I'd gone without inhabiting this world that I now called Flicker Street. And that's kind of, I spun out from that into other projects. So I'm going to do a part 2 of this, and I'll pick up, I guess, around 2005 to 2007, and we'll talk about the next actual period of Flicker Street. There was kind of a false start period for a few years, and then there were influences of other creative things I was doing. Like in 2004, I became involved in the online Wald Newton and Philip was a Farmer fan community. So that had a huge influence in my direction. It took me away from my own creations into writing about and thinking about, other people's characters. But anyway, I will come back and we'll talk about that and we'll get to this document called Flicker Street, The Birth, and where I'm at now. So thanks for listening.